Hello and welcome to Gojit Documentaries. Here we explore and learn the world together. Edited by Titus K Jr. Hadzabe, social structure. One telling of Hadza's oral history divides their past into 4 epochs, each inhabited by a different culture. According to this tradition, at the beginning of time, the world was inhabited by hairy giants called the Hadzabe First Ones or Hadzabe Ancient Ones. The Hadzabe did not possess tools or fire. They hunted game by running it down until it fell dead. They ate meat raw. They did not build houses, but slept under trees, as the Hadza do today in the dry season. In older versions of this story, they did not use fire because it was physically impossible in the Earth's primeval state. Younger Hadza, who have been to school, say that the Hadzabe did not know how to use fire. In the second epoch, the Hadzabe were succeeded by the Hadzabe in between ones, who were equally gigantic, but without hair. Fire could be made and used to cook meat, but animals had grown more wary of humans and had to be chased and hunted by dogs. The Hadzabe were the first people to use medicines and charms to protect themselves from enemies and initiated the Epim rite. They lived in caves. The third epoch was inhabited by the people of Hadzabe recent days, who were smaller than their predecessors. They invented bows and arrows, cooked with containers, and mastered the use of fire. They also built huts like those of Hadza today. The people of Hadzabe were the first of the Hadza ancestors to have contact with non-foraging people, with whom they traded for iron to make knives and arrowheads. They also invented the gambling game Lukuchuko. The fourth epoch continues today, and is inhabited by the Hadzabe, those of today. When discussing the Hadzabe epoch, people often mention specific names and places, and can say approximately how many generations ago events occurred. Archaeology and genetic history. The Hadza are not closely related to any other people. The Hadza language was once classified with the Khoisan languages because it has click consonants. However, there is no further evidence they are related. Genetically, the Hadza do not appear to be closely related to Khoisan speakers. Even the Sandor, who live around 150 kilometers (93 miles) away, diverged from the Hadza more than 15,000 years ago. Genetic testing also suggests significant admixture has occurred between the Hadza and Bantu. Minor admixture with Nilotic and Cushitic-speaking populations may have occurred in the last few thousand years. Today, a few Hadza women marry into neighboring groups, such as the Bantu Asanzu and the Nilotic Dituga, but these marriages often fail, and the women and their children return to the Hadza. In previous decades, rape and capture of Hadza women by outsiders seems to have been common. During a famine in 1918-20, some Hadza men were reported as taking Isanzu wives. The Hadza's ancestors have probably lived in their current territory for tens of thousands of years. Hadzaland is about 50 kilometers, 31 miles from Olduvai Gorge, an area sometimes called the cradle of mankind because of the number of hominin fossils found there, and 40 kilometers 25 miles from the prehistoric site of Latoli. Archaeological evidence suggests that the area has been continuously occupied by hunter-gatherers, much like the Hadza, since at least the beginning of the later Stone Age, 50,000 years ago. Although the Hadza do not make rock art today, they consider several rock art sites within their territory, probably at least 2,000 years old, to have been created by their ancestors, and their oral history does not suggest they moved to Hadzaland from elsewhere. Pre-colonial period. Until about 500 BCE, Tanzania was exclusively occupied by hunter-gatherers akin to the Hadza. The first agriculturalists to enter the region were Cushitic-speaking cattle herders from the Horn of Africa. Around 500 CE, the Bantu expansion reached Tanzania, bringing populations of farmers with iron tools and weapons. The last major ethnic group to enter the region were Nilotic pastoralists who migrated south from Sudan in the 18th century. Each of these expansions of farming and herding peoples displaced earlier populations of hunter-gatherers, who were at a demographic and technological disadvantage and vulnerable to the loss of environmental resources, i.e., foraging areas and habitats for game, to farmland and pastures. Groups such as the Hadza and the Sandor are remnants of indigenous hunter-gatherer populations that were once much more widespread, and they are under continued pressure from the expansion of agriculture into their traditional lands. Farmers and herders appeared in the vicinity of Hadzaland relatively recently. The Isanzu, a Bantu farming people, began living south of Hadzaland around 1850. The pastoralist Iraq and Dituga were both forced to migrate into the area by the expansion of the Maasai, the former in the 19th century and the latter in the 1910s. The Hadza also have direct contact with the Maasai and with the Sukuma west of Lake Eyasi. The upheavals caused by the Maasai expansion in the late 19th century caused a decline in the Hadza population. The Hadza's interaction with many of these peoples has been hostile. Pastoralists often killed Hadza as reprisals for the theft of livestock, since the Hadza did not have the notion of animal ownership and would hunt them as they would wild game. The general attitude of neighboring agro-pastoralists towards the Hadza was prejudicial. They viewed them as backward, lacking a real language, and made up of the dispossessed of neighboring tribes that had fled into the forest out of poverty or because they committed a crime. Many of these misconceptions were transmitted to early colonial visitors to the region who wrote about the Hadzabe. The Isanzu were hostile to the Hadza at times. Isanzu people may have captured them as part of the slave trade until as late as the 1870s, when it was halted by the German colonial government. Later interactions were more peaceful, with the two peoples sometimes intermarrying and residing together. Though as late as 1912, the Hadza were reported as being ready for war with the Isanzu. Still, folktales depict the Isanzu as favorable and, at times, heroic, unlike the Iraq and the cattle-raiding Maasai. Moreover, many goods and customs come from them, and the Hadza myths mention and depict a benevolent influence of the Isanzu in their mythology. The Sukuma and the Hadza had a more amicable relationship. The Sukuma drove their herds and sold caravans through Hadza lands and exchanged old metal tools, which the Hadza made into arrowheads, for the right to hunt elephants in Hadzaland. A Hadza hut. Huts have been built in this style for as long as records have been kept. In the late 19th century, European powers claimed much of the African continent as colonies in a period known as the Scramble for Africa. The Hadza became part of German East Africa, though there is no evidence that Europeans had ever visited Hadzaland before the colony was proclaimed. The earliest mention of the Hadza in a written account is in German explorer Oscar Baumann's Durchmaß Islands in Nilkel 1894. The Hadza hid from Baumann and other early explorers, and their descriptions are based on second-hand accounts. The first Europeans to report meeting the Hadza are Arto Demwolf and Erich Obst. The latter lived with them for 8 weeks in 1911. German Tanganyika came under British control at the end of the First World War, 1917, and soon after. British colonial officer F.J. Bagshaw wrote about the Hadza. The accounts of these early European visitors portray the Hadza at the beginning of the 20th century as living in the same way as they do today. Early on, Obst noted a distinction between what he considered the pure Hadza, those subsisting purely by hunting and gathering, and those that lived with the Isanzu and practiced some cultivation. The foraging Hadza foraged and hunted using many of the same techniques they do today. Game was more plentiful in the early 20th century because farmers had not yet begun directly encroaching on their lands. Some early reports describe the Hadza as having chiefs or big men, but those reports were probably mistaken. More reliable accounts portray the early 20th century Hadza as egalitarian, as they are today, 20, They also lived in similarly sized camps, used the same tools, built houses in the same style, and had similar religious beliefs. The British colonial government tried to make the Hadza settle down and adopt farming in 1927, the first of many such government efforts. The British tried again in 1939. The independent Tanzanian government tried in 1965 and 1990, and various foreign missionary groups have tried the same since the 1960s. These numerous attempts, some forceful, have largely failed. Generally, the Hadza willingly settle as long as provided food stocks last, then leave and resume their traditional hunter-gatherer lives when the provisions run out. Few have adopted farming for sustenance. Disease is also a problem, because their communities are sparse and isolated. Few Hadza are immune to common infectious diseases such as measles, which thrive in sedentary communities, and several settlement attempts ended with outbreaks of illness, resulting in many deaths, particularly of children. Citation needed. Of the 4 villages built for the Hadza since 1965, Tuyida Chini and Munguli are now inhabited by the Isanzu, Iraq, and Dituga. Another, Mongo Washington Mono, established in 1988, is sporadically occupied by Hadza groups who stay there for a few months at a time, either farming, foraging, or using the food given to them by missionaries. At the 4th village, Ndamaga, also known as Mwanyam, some Hadza children attend school, but they account for just a third of the students there. Numerous attempts to convert the Hadza to Christianity have also been largely unsuccessful. Tanzanian farmers began moving into the Mongolia area to grow onions in the 1940s, but they came in small numbers until the 1960s. The first German plantation in Hadzaland was established in 1928, and later 3 European families settled in the area. Since the 1960s, the Hadza have been visited regularly by anthropologists, linguists, geneticists, and other researchers. In recent years, Hadza territory has seen increasing encroachment from neighboring peoples. The western Hadza lands are now a private hunting reserve, and the Hadza are officially restricted to a reservation within the reserve and prohibited from hunting there. The Yida Valley, long uninhabited due to the tsetse fly, is now settled by Dituga herders who are clearing the Hadza lands on either side of the valley for pasture for their goats and cattle. The Dituga hunt out the game, and their land clearing destroys the berries, tubers, and honey that the Hadza rely on. Watering holes for Dituga cattle can cause the shallow watering holes that the Hadza rely on to dry up. Most Hadzabe are no longer able to sustain themselves in the bush without supplementary food such as ugoli. After appearing in documentaries on the Hadza on PBS and the BBC in 2001, the Mangola Hadza have become a tourist attraction. Although this may seem to help the Hadzabe, much of the money from tourism is allocated to government offices and tourism companies instead of the Hadzabe. Money given directly to Hadzabe also contributes to alcoholism, and deaths from alcohol poisoning have recently become a severe problem, further contributing to the loss of cultural knowledge. In 2007, the local government controlling the Hadza lands adjacent to the Yida Valley leased the entire 6,500 square kilometers, 2,500 square miles, of land to the Ol Noyam royal family of the United Arab Emirates for use as a personal safari playground. Both the Hadza and Dituga were evicted, with some Hadza resistors imprisoned. However, after protests from the Hadza and negative coverage in the international press, the deal was rescinded. Thank you for walking with us all through the Hadza social structure documentary. Prepared by Titus K Jr. Subscribe and comment on which tribe or part we should visit next. Let's explore together. This is Gojit Documentaries.